This is a story all about how one German aviator on a peacekeeping mission made Tetris, the perceived antithesis of a political game, wildly political. The Tetris tile is an ubiquitous symbol of video gaming, alongside the Pong paddle, the one-up mushroom, and the Space Invader. It speaks volumes that the game is on permanent display in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and on a local scale, even games today like Tricky Towers are building and innovating on top of Tetris' 30-year legacy. So real quick before we get into the adventures of the Soviets versus Tetris, here's a little backstory about how the now world-renowned puzzle evolved from a computerized pentominoes mini-game into a cultural monolith. Alexei Pajitnov was a computer scientist at the Moscow Academy of Science. He also created Tetris. During a cold night in 1984, Alexei became embroiled in a conversation with co-worker and friend Vladimir Pakilko. They talked about the profound value of games and puzzles, how art defines humanity, and how gaming is the focal point where competition, identity, and fun converge. A little time later, Nintendo pretty much defined the video game market. Alexei, however, being a scientist, wanted to condense what made gaming so popular into a formula. He looked at the challenge, the reward, the frustration, and finally, the closure. This process is still, today, what defines gaming, and given the emergent technology at the time, also gave Alexei all the tools and inspiration he needed to create the first version of Tetris. Now Tetris, in its most primordial form, was designed on an Electronica 60, and despite the text aesthetic, Alexei's initial creation spread around the Moscow Academy of Science like wildfire. Using that four-pronged gaming formula in such a simple and discerning way created a perfect stimulus. The constant tension and relief of misplaced blocks being wiped away triggered the player's prefrontal cortex, which powers motivation. This type of tension and resolve is known in psychology as the Zeigarnik effect, an eponym derived from the Soviet psychiatrist Bluma Zeigarnik. The game's popularity soared, and Tetris was eventually developed with graphics and to run on MS-DOS. It fit onto a 5.25-inch floppy disk, making it easy to pass around from person to person. However, since Russia was a communist country in 1984, private citizens had no power to promote a business. Alexei could have been arrested and jailed for even attempting to sell his game. Eventually, a physical copy of the game escaped Russia into Hungary for publishing. From here, a whole mess of legal battles ensued across many years. If you want to know more about that particular topic, I can't stress how great Box Brown's book, Tetris, the Games People Play, is. Not only is the art within it super expressive, Brown does a stellar job of documenting and livening the history of how a legal skirmish almost stopped Tetris from being what it is today. It's a bloody good read. Anyway, getting back to our story. In 1986, Russian and American relations were on the up, and though disarmament talks initially collapsed, the Reykjavik summit between President Ronald Reagan and General Communist Party Mikhail Gorbachev was one of the first steps to signing what's called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. I know this doesn't sound video gamey, but look, the specifics aren't particularly relevant. However, with hands being shaken, mutually assured nuclear destruction had a pin put in it. For a while. But it was at this point in history, Tetris' rights, unlawfully, had been sold to Spectrum Holobyte and Mirrorsoft to be released in the United States and the UK. It was at this time a German pilot named Mathias Rust immortalized himself with one plane trip and turned Tetris from an insanely popular puzzle game into a politically charged piece of software that had the potential to ruin US and Russian relations. The Berlin Wall was still standing, and after seeing the failure of the Reykjavik summit, at a brazen 18 years of age, Mathias Rust attempted to create an imaginary bridge between the east and the west by landing a small aircraft slap bang in the middle of the Red Square in Moscow. He flew via Helsinki and right through the Iron Curtain. Though Soviet air defense was tracking Rust, they failed to stop him. Some sources believe this is because they confused his small aircraft with some of their own fighters, and although Rust's intentions were that of peace, and his landing reception was, in his words, carefree and welcoming, this affront to the Soviet defense was provocative beyond belief. Rust received 4 years in a labor camp, which was a moderate sentence all things considered. The political aftermath, however, centered around the failings of the Soviet air defense. This gave Gorbachev an excuse to fire specific generals that were blocking his proposed reforms for the country. Rust claims credits for those reforms. Meanwhile, 5,000 miles in the west, Mirrorsoft were struggling to find ways to market Tetris to American audiences. With relations improved, the Western public became curious about what life was like behind the Iron Curtain. So, Mirrorsoft and Spectrum Holobyte took full advantage of that, beefing up Tetris' graphics and adding in a whole mess of stereotypical Russian images, including an animation of a small aircraft flying over the Red Square. Tetris creator Alexei was not super stoked on the idea of throwing a hotly political icon into his simple puzzles, and forced the Western publishers to amend the game. Alexei was in constant contact with Robert Stein, the first person to discover Tetris outside of Russia, who was bending over backwards to keep the Russians happy. After all, if word got back to the Soviets that the US were using a figure that undermined their air defense in a game that reduces and spoofs their culture, Tetris' journey to become a cultural icon would have ended there. Even then, a forward-thinking person like Alexei Pajitnov was of the mind that many people find themselves in today, seeing no reason to concern politics with video games. But this story, if anything, showcases that there is no happy middle. Nothing is created in a vacuum. Tetris, though simple and dexterous in its design, was still influenced widely by the political landscape. Even AAA games today that have smooth rollouts will be morphed by the agendas of the developers, the publishers, and even the consumers. As Alexei originally said, art defines humanity, but it does so as much as humanity defines its art. For Tetris, the world's curiosity of the Soviets caused the game to develop a Russian identity that didn't exist in the first few years of its distribution. Think about this, if you ask anyone today to sing a Russian song, they'll most likely hum the Russian folk song Korobeniki, which most people know is the Tetris theme music. The fact is that politics is inseparable from creation. Gaming specifically, we saw a huge surge of indie games that contained both liberal and Republican messages during the recent American election. Games like Bomb the Right Place, which is an unwinnable point-and-click game that highlights our callous worldview of the Middle East. But we also saw Feminazi the Triggering get more Steam traffic as the anti-social justice warrior rhetoric reached a crescendo. These games are what some people think of as political. They are political by way of design as well as nature. However, to more or lesser extents, all games, because they are created in moments that will be recognised as history, are political in nature. To deny Tetris its politics is to deny it its history, and to do a disservice to the game that is lauded by all people of all ages and gaming sensibilities. And that's, for better or worse, due in part to Mathias Rust.